Hello, I'm Esther Githu. It's Thursday, September 22nd. This is Africa 54.
Many nations have joined U.S. President Joe Biden in condemning Russia's attack on Ukraine and making nuclear threats. VOA's Anita Powell has more from New York. A major South African business leader claims wealthy nations are buying up Ukraine grain that Africa desperately needs. VOA's Peter Claudy has the interview. Women hire car riders get a new safety app in Nigeria connecting them with female drivers. All this and much more on today's Africa 54.
We begin in Somalia, where the U.S. military says on Wednesday it had killed 27 fighters from the Al-Shabaab militant group in an airstrike in Somalia's central Hiran region. The army and allied forces have launched an offensive against the insurgents in the last month in Hiram. The United States has been carrying out airstrikes in Somalia against Al-Shabaab for years. Sunday's strike was the sixth recorded in 2022, according to the U.S. Africa Command website. In the midst of the worst drought in 40 years in Somalia, residents in Hiran region say Al-Shabaab is torching houses, destroying wells and killing civilians. The militants who are seeking to overthrow the Western-backed central government and implement a strict interpretation of Islamic law were killed while attacking federal forces near Bulobarde, a town around 200 kilometers north of the capital, Mogadishu. U.S. President Joe Biden called out Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine at the United Nations as the Russian president significantly escalated war efforts and threatened nuclear retaliation. White House correspondent Anita Powell reports from New York.
U.S. President Joe Biden used most of his Wednesday address to the annual United Nations General Assembly in New York to condemn Moscow.
Let us speak plainly. A permanent member of the United Nations Security Council invaded its neighbor, attempted to erase a sovereign state from the map.
Biden accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of organizing a sham referendum to annex parts of Ukraine. Hours before world leaders gathered at the UN headquarters, Putin announced a partial mobilization of his military and raised concerns of a nuclear attack.
We will certainly use all the means at our disposal. This is not a bluff.
Putin's announcement came after Ukrainian troops pushed back in the country's northeast. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke via recorded video, the only leader exempted by the UN's in-person speakers-only rule.
A crime has been committed against Ukraine, and we demand just punishment.
Putin's escalation came at a fortuitous time, amid potential war fatigue among UN members.
From a diplomatic standpoint for Ukraine and for Ukraine's backers, I do think this helped sharpen the focus on that conflict and also probably had the effect of isolating Russia to an even greater degree than it's already been isolated.
Biden said he supports expanding the UN Security Council, a move that permanent members Russia and China have opposed.
This includes permanent seats for those nations we have long supported and permanent seats for countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean.
To address global food insecurity, Biden announced over $2.9 billion in aid and a bigger contribution toward the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria.
That means we're going to work with our partners in Congress to contribute another $6 billion to the Global Fund.
President and First Lady Jill Biden returned to Washington Thursday. Anita Powell, VOA News, New York.
Newly elected Kenyan President William Ruto called on international partners to help Africa deal with drought, climate change, disasters, and economic crisis triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic and fueled by Russia's invasion of neighboring Ukraine. Ruto made the call during his first address to the United Nations General Assembly just 8 days after assuming office in East Africa's largest economy.
Many countries now bear witness to the unsettling phenomena of rivers, canals, and water reservoirs that are drying up on account of drought and heat waves occasioned by climate change. Kenya is no exception. The northern arid and semi-arid rangelands of our country have been gravely impacted by drought, whose severity has not been seen or experienced in 40 years. 3.1 million residents of these atolls are now severely food insecure on account of scarce rainfall over 3 consecutive seasons, leading to poor crop and pasture. This unprecedented confluence of intensely adverse events has exacerbated water scarcity and starvation, worsened by rising food prices, thus complicating Kenya's roadmap towards delivering good quality of life to our citizens.
Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema, while condemning the war in Ukraine, told the United Nations General Assembly that the impact of Russia's invasion of neighboring Ukraine has already undermined decades of progress in fighting poverty in Africa and elsewhere.
Zambia joins other governments in expressing particular concern about the ongoing war in Ukraine. As we stand with all those affected, both inside Ukraine and in the neighboring countries, we also take this opportunity to stress the far-reaching negative consequences of this war, particularly on the prices of food across the world, fuel, fertilizer, and other key commodities. War in any part of the world, Mr. President, has a damaging effect on economic activity, which derails our collective fight against poverty and hunger. A few months of war can erase decades of progress. And I think we need to take note of this. We therefore categorically condemn war anyway, and we continue to urge all parties involved to pursue diplomatic solutions to conflict resolution.
Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari, leader of Africa's most populous country, also warned that the war triggered by Russia's invasion of neighboring Ukraine has created strains that are perhaps unprecedented for a generation, thus limiting global capacity to resolve conflicts elsewhere.
The ongoing war in Ukraine is making it more difficult to tackle the perennial issues that feature each year in the deliberations of this assembly, such as nuclear disarmament, the right of the Rohingya refugees to return to their homes in Myanmar, and the Palestinians' legitimate aspirations for statehood and reduction of inequalities within and among the nations. The danger of escalation of the war in Ukraine further justifies Nigeria's resolute calls for a nuclear-free world and a universal arms trade treaty. I remain firmly convinced that the challenges that have come so sharply into focus in recent years and months emphasize the call by Nigeria and many other member states for the reform of the Security Council and other United Nations agencies.
Zimbabwe's President Emerson Mnangagwa also addressed the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly on Thursday. He spoke on a variety of issues, including the sanctions imposed on his government.
Despite the illegal economic sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe successfully implemented its COVID-19 national response strategy, encouraged largely by our own internal resources and institutional capacities. The proactive approach by my administration enabled the country to achieve high vaccination rates, which extended to children up to 12 years. Meanwhile, our focus on the construction, rehabilitation, and modernization of health facilities across the country, coupled with enhanced capacities around biotechnology and the pharmaceutical value chain, attest to my government's determination to realize universal health coverage.
For more on the ongoing 77th United Nations General Assembly, I'm joined live from New York by VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bashir. Hello, Margaret.
Hi, Esther.
What we've heard this morning is a wide condemnation from leaders, including President Biden, Antonio Guterres, and African leaders as well, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Is there a general consensus on the next course of action against Vladimir Putin?
Yes, and today the spotlight really has shifted from the General Assembly into the Security Council, where there's a high-level meeting right now going on of foreign ministers who belong to the Security Council. And there's a lot of talk in there, not great for Russia, and it must be hard for the Russians to sit there and hear it. Foreign Minister Lavrov didn't sit through the whole meeting. He only came in to make his speech. He had someone else sitting at the table throughout, which prompted the Ukrainian foreign minister to comment that the Russian diplomats flee from the Security Council the way some of their citizens flee from the draft that's going on now in Russia to mobilize 300,000 more troops to send to Ukraine. But I think what we're hearing is growing isolation of Russia and growing pressure, and that can be political pressure like sanctions. The European Union foreign ministers met here last night, and they said that they're going to look at new sanctions against Russia if they go ahead with these sham referenda that they want to do in 4 areas that they're occupying in Ukraine, and also diplomatic pressure. We heard today from Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, good friend of Moscow, calling for dialogue and diplomacy to end this war. Same from India's foreign minister. So, even Moscow's friends are very uncomfortable with the war. And actually, we heard from Ghana's foreign minister at the meeting. She was quite strong, Shirley Batshuayi, and she said that the barrel of the gun doesn't provide a way to talks. And she quoted her president, who spoke in the General Assembly on Wednesday, and he said that the cost of this war is high, not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for the world. And he said every bullet and every bomb that hits a target in Ukraine hits our pockets. And she repeated that in the council today.
Briefly, Margaret, what kind of support is President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine expecting to see coming out of this meeting?
One word for you, Esther: weapons. President Zelensky gave a speech by video yesterday in the General Assembly, and he said he wants Russia to be punished. He said Ukraine can fight this war, but they need weapons. And he said if Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. So he said we need to continue fighting, for our lives, basically, for our country.
Right. Thank you so much, Margaret. VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bashir talking to us live from UN headquarters in New York. The president of the South African Chamber of Commerce to the U.S., Neil Diamond, has expressed concern following reports that grains from Ukraine are being sent to wealthy nations and leaving out Africa. He also says the ongoing energy crisis facing South Africa is affecting businesses and society. Mr. Diamond spoke with VOA's Peter Clotty on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly, ongoing now in New York.
I think that is a very big concern. African food security, like food security across all the world, is very important. We currently have over 350 million Africans starving, in dire need of food, and if there's not an equitable distribution of food across the globe, it adversely affects emerging countries and benefits those more developed countries. They are also in a better position to pay top dollar for grain, which disproportionately affects Africa and adversely affects those hungry people on our continent.
Neil, let's look at industrialization, particularly in South Africa. How do you see this happening in spite of the challenges in the country?
We have seen a steady decline over the last 2 decades of investment, direct foreign investment, not just in South Africa, but in sub-Sahara Africa, which means that there's been a decline in the industrialization of the country with job losses associated. Africa's got the largest population of youth on the planet. And in order for us to provide skills and jobs to those young people, we need to ensure the re-industrialization of not just the South African economy, but also the sub-Sahara economy. And that can only be done if there's a renewed focus on investment and capacitation of existing industrial capacity on the continent within those countries.
What about infrastructural development? Because great improved infrastructural development or adequate infrastructure could help boost the economy, create the enabling environment for job creation for the country's youth. Talk to me about infrastructure development in South Africa, because sometimes I've heard officials of the government say they are investing, others are saying not so much and they are not doing so much, especially coming from the opposition saying the government appears not to be doing enough in infrastructure development. Your take?
Our government definitely needs to refocus on the investment of water infrastructure, of energy infrastructure, but we're also in a new environment where digital infrastructure is very important. The largest uptake of mobile technology is on the African continent, and if we want to ensure that people can get the full benefit of those new technologies, we need to ensure that our digital infrastructure is on the same level as most Western nations.
Talk to me about mining beneficiation, because you know South Africa is a big mining country, gold and other minerals. Talk to me about it.
Mining beneficiation historically has been done outside of the African continent. We need to rebuild capacity to beneficiate our mineral resources and those that have been extracted from the land to be done in Africa. Mining beneficiation could be a catalyst for job creation, for skills development, much needed on our continent.
What impact do you think the current energy crisis currently being experienced in South Africa is having on society and business?
That's a great question. The current energy crisis has got a crippling effect on business, but also on ordinary South Africans, and it spills over into government's own ability to deliver services to our communities. So we need to look at a sustainable long-term solution for the energy crisis.
Neil Diamond is the president of the South African Chamber of Commerce to the U.S., speaking with VOA's Peter Claudy. For more of that interview, go to voaafrica.com. Ordinary South Africans feel the brunt of an excessive power outage schedule, meaning many households go without electricity for up to 8 hours a day. As a result, the country is in the grip of an electricity crisis, leading to unprecedented nationwide blackouts in Africa's most developed economy. The state-owned power utility Eskom, which produces about 95% of the country's electricity, is implementing the scheduled blackouts to save electricity as it struggles to keep its aging and poorly maintained coal-fired power stations operational.
For the past 15 years, South Africa has been experiencing power cuts. But the crisis has now reached unacceptable levels. Some communities are now spending up to 9 hours a day without electricity. The results have been devastating. Students have failed to meet deadlines, and workers are arriving at work late because of malfunctioning traffic lights. Eating cold food and having cold baths has become a norm. And these citizens say enough is enough.
It is now really, very, very bad. Actually, it's frustrating when you get home, it's dark. That will be the time you're preparing food for the kids. And the kids, it's that time of the exams. It's dark, we have to light up the candles. How can you study using a candle?
It's frustrating because now you get to, firstly to make it to home, to make it to work firstly, it's a mission because you can wake up and there's no power. And as much as now we're working from home, you could be trying to work at home and there's still no power. So now you're forced to go to the office. Sometimes things are urgent or you're doing events, as I told you, I'm doing marketing. So sometimes there's no generators and stuff. So an entire 6 hours of your day could be gone.
It's killing business. It's making it very hard to be positive. That's what it is. It's killing jobs, killing business.
The crisis has forced President Cyril Ramaphosa to cut short his overseas trip. On arrival, he convened an urgent meeting with his cabinet. However, days later, the power cuts are still raging like an uncontrollable bushfire with no sign of end in sight. Tuso Kumalo for VOA News, Johannesburg.
On the sidelines of the 77th United Nations General Assembly, other expert groups are meeting to discuss global and regional issues such as health, food security, and economic well-being of the regions they represent. One such group is the Islamic Development Bank, a multilateral bank with observer status at the UNGA. And joining me live from New York is Mansour Muhtar, Vice President of Islamic Development Bank Group that represents 57 countries. Mr. Muhtar, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you very much.
I am having trouble hearing Mr. Muhtar.
Thank you for giving me this.
Well, so with the 57 members in your organizations, what is the main focus for your organization to help spur growth in the African continent?
Well, as a multilateral development bank, we were set up to assist member countries in their socio-economic development efforts. And we have, as you acknowledged, 57 member countries, of which 27 are African countries. And we really focus on providing financial resources and technical assistance and advisory services to both the public and private sector. And since inception, we have provided resources to the tune of $65 billion since 1975 to African countries, some of which was aimed at promoting or supporting trade financing. And as I said, we also have other initiatives in place. In addition to that, we have been trying to support our member countries, the African countries, and other countries address the challenges posed by the recent global food crisis, building on the support we provided for COVID-19. For the food crisis, we are earmarking $10.5 billion, and for COVID-19, we spent about $4.5 billion to support member countries.
Let me ask you about empowering women, especially women, young women in the continent of Africa. What is your focus here to give them skills that will empower them economically so that they don't have to rely on aid or other kinds of help because these are the future of the continent?
Well, as a articulated women and youth empowerment policy 2 years ago that aims at mainstreaming gender and youth in all our operations. So all our lending operations, we look at ways of supporting women, but we also have specific programs for women, targeting women that are aimed at providing them with credit, particularly in the small and medium enterprise sphere, but also technical and vocational education support in our member countries to equip them with the needed skills that would help them earn a good living. So a lot of work going on in that area.
Mr. Mansour, we'll leave it there, and good luck with the global fund to help refugees in Africa. Mr. Mansour Muhtar is the Vice President of the Islamic Development Bank. And here are other stories that you might have missed. Nigeria's military is urging people in 3 northwestern states to leave forested areas ahead of a bombing campaign targeting bandits and terrorists, according to local broadcast stations and a military official. Guinea's ruling military junta on Thursday accused the president of the West African Regional Bloc, ECOWAS, Umaru Sissoco Embalo, of lies over his call for sanctions on Conakry if it seeks a 3-year transition back to civilian rule. During a visit to Guinea, Embalo said he had secured an agreement with the junta to give way to elected civilians after 2 years. And one person was killed and 2 others wounded in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo on Thursday during a demonstration against the M23 rebel group, according to local officials. A ride-hailing app with an all-female drivers launched recently in Nigeria amid reports in local media of assault and harassment of female passengers and drivers. Francesca Lena has the details.
Nigerian ride-hailing app HerRide employs exclusively women drivers. Monsieur Ali Aluafuyi launched the app in August 2022 after hearing stories about sexual assault of female passengers and drivers.
We don't want cases where women have to be on their toes, on the edge when they're using ride-hailing services. So HerRide is there to provide safer alternatives for women.
The app started with 10 drivers and logged roughly 500 journeys in its first month in Nigeria's capital, Abuja. Hawa Shakir is one user. The fashion designer says she's had scary experiences from using other services in the past.
Sometimes drivers having unnecessary conversations with you, or the way they're dressed, they come off as, of course, you'll be scared because they're guys. You feel like they want to attack you or something, or some funny conversations they're having with you where they're trying to get unnecessarily personal and you're wondering why.
Adetutu Patricia Oni has driven for ride-hailing apps for 3 years. She says HerRide has improved her work because riders are screened and know what to expect.
We get discriminated on a lot. Like when you have a request that is from a male client, they may tend to cancel the ride because they don't want to ride with you being a female.
Nigeria does not have official statistics on sexual assaults linked to ride-hailing apps, but stories abound in local media. Reports of sexual assaults, robbery and harassment of female passengers and drivers. In the United States, apps Uber and Lyft say they've received thousands of reports of sexual assaults among billions of rides. Uber says riders accounted for roughly half of those accused. Lyft did not disclose details of what share of incidents resulted in drivers being harmed. Ali Aluafuyi says HerRide also aims to expand opportunities for female drivers and plans to expand elsewhere in Nigeria.
If you look at the statistics all over the world, there are very few women who are drivers on these ride-hailing apps. It means that you can identify and highlight the few barriers that is not making women to get into the mobility industry.
That was Francesca Lena of Reuters reporting. And that wraps up our show this Thursday. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.